If we focus on what Israel is saying with regard to Iran, how it is going to strike at any moment and that it's not taking nuclear sites off of the table, and that the strike could come at any moment, what do you believe would happen? How would Iran respond? And maybe you can give us a little bit of context into what exactly is possible here and what would transpire should this incredibly catastrophic and dangerous move and threat that Israel and powerful voices on the U.S. side are threatening. We have Donald Trump and the elites who support Donald Trump also calling for the most intense targeting of Iran, particularly at the nuclear level.
Well, first of all, the Israeli regime can't do that much damage to the nuclear program because it is, for the most part, and all the key elements of it are deep underground. And therefore, the damage, they could do damage, which would have, let's say, mostly propaganda value. But in my opinion, if the Israelis do that, the Iranians would then have the opportunity to leave the NPT. And the Iranians could also change their nuclear posture, meaning they could move away from just simply having a peaceful nuclear program. Because Dr. Kamal Kharazi, who is an advisor to the leader and who is also close to the current administration, and who was the former foreign minister during President Khatami for 8 years, he said twice, at least twice that I know, that if Iran feels threatened, if there's since I don't remember the exact wordings, I'll refrain from going further. All I'll say is that he spoke of the possibility of Iran changing its nuclear posture under certain circumstances. Let's say if there's a nuclear threat or if there's maybe a threat to Iran's nuclear program. So an attack wouldn't have that much impact, but it could actually open a new path for the Iranian government. But there's also another scenario, and there is that possibility that the Americans, like the Israelis, would not carry out an attack on the nuclear program, and then the Americans would afterwards say, yes, the Israelis wanted to do this, and we encouraged them not to do it. We put pressure on them not to do so. So the attack was very limited, and therefore the Iranians have no excuse to retaliate. Something like that. In other words, pretend that the Israelis wanted to do this, but they listened to us, and so now the Iranians should not retaliate, which is not, if that is the plan, it's not going to work. The Iranian retaliation will be very large, and it will be much more significant than the Israeli strike. And I think it will be different from the strike we saw last week. But let's imagine that the Israelis did carry out this attack, or an attack on the Iranian, let's say, oil industry or other key infrastructure. The military, the missile program and the defense programs, they're all very well protected, because you have to keep in mind that the Iranians have always been concerned about American aggression. So Iran has, over the years, built much of its infrastructure deep underground, as we see in Lebanon, as we see in Yemen, as we see in Syria. The airstrikes that the Israelis carry out, usually what they hit are small arms ammunition depots. They cause big fires, but they're not really that important. The real capabilities are deep underground in Syria. All of these countries, because of the U.S. Air Force and the Air Force that the West has given to the Israeli regime, protect themselves through these tunnels. So Lebanon has thousands of kilometers of tunnels. And that's why over the last few days, the Israelis have been badly beaten on the border because Hezbollah is using its underground capabilities, moving troops around, surprising the Israelis, and killing large numbers of Israeli troops without giving many casualties. The Israelis, out of anger and despair, they go and bomb cities and slaughter women and children, but that's a different story. So if the Israelis strike, whether they carry out massive damage or create massive damage at, let's say, a petrochemical plant or an oil installation or a gas installation or any other a refinery or a series of refineries, that is possible. But the Iranian response will be very massive. It will be disproportionate because Iran is adamant that deterrence is created. This is a lawless regime. It will be allowed to do whatever it wants. The West supports the Israeli regime. We've seen how Western governments will support Israel till the last Palestinian and now to the last Lebanese. They bomb simultaneously Syria, Iraq, Yemen, Lebanon. The West Bank, the occupied West Bank, was bombed where about 20 people were killed in a cafe. A whole family was wiped out in the West Bank. This has nothing to do with Gaza. This is a lawless regime which the West allows to do everything. It provides it with whatever it needs, do what it needs. So Iran has to create deterrence. There's no option but to create deterrence. So Iran will strike back very hard. Now, that could lead to further Israeli attacks, but we have to remember that Iranian missile and drone capabilities are huge. They are endless in a sense. Why? Because, as I said earlier, Iran prepared all these underground cities, underground missile and drone bases across the country because they were concerned about not Israel, but an American attack against the country. And the United States is far more powerful than Israel. So all these bases were created to strike the Americans in the Persian Gulf, American assets across West Asia, in the Red Sea, wherever American assets are, the underground bases were created to strike back at the Americans in case of an attack. So the Iranians have hundreds of thousands of missiles and hundreds of thousands of drones, and they can just send wave after wave after wave to Israel. The Israelis can shoot down 1,000 drones, spending $10 billion maybe, which would cause as much damage as if the drone struck the targets. But after 1,000 drones or 1,500 drones, they will have no more ammunition to stop them. The missiles, the Iranians have not used most of their advanced missiles yet. From my understanding, Iran has not used hypersonic missiles yet either, because that was in the news and I was under the impression that they did. But the point is that Iran can do a lot of harm to the Israeli regime as it is fighting in the south and the north and in the West Bank. So it's not in an ideal situation. It does not have, except for Jordan, which is the king is an ally of Netanyahu, but ordinary Jordanians despise the regime. So if the regime is substantially weakened, that could make it far more vulnerable, especially if people are demoralized. So this is a choice for the Israeli regime to make. I personally think that Netanyahu probably understands this, and he knows that this is not a winning scenario. But I believe that Netanyahu is desperate to draw in the Americans into the war. So let us imagine that happens. Let's say the Americans are foolish enough to enter the war in support of Israel. All American assets in Iraq would be swept away by the resistance. And the resistance in Iraq is outraged. They've mobilized the Iraqi population by murdering Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah. They've awoken a force in Iraq that was asleep. And Iraq is much bigger than Lebanon, and it has a much larger population. It's united people as well in a way in which we haven't seen before. So they would be swept away in Iran. And in the Persian Gulf region, American bases would be seen as hostile, would be targeted. That's what all those underground bases that Iran has are for. But more importantly, those regimes that host American bases, they will be seen as hostile, and they will be targeted too. They cannot pretend that they're neutral. They can say we're neutral and we have nothing to do with this. No, they have American bases hosted there. Those bases are used by the Americans against Iran, whether they admit it or not. When the Iranians carried out both attacks on Israel, American radar installations in the Persian Gulf region and in Turkey were used to help the American Navy and Air Force, as well as the Israelis, to bring down drones and some missiles. So if this happens, then those oil and gas installations would be destroyed. Tankers, everything would be destroyed. And that would lead to a global economic collapse. And that would change the lives of everyone everywhere. And millions of people would be on the move. And if someone says, well, the United States is too powerful, the United States couldn't defeat Ansar Allah in the Red Sea. So how are they going to defeat the combined forces of the resistance in Iran in particular in the Persian Gulf? Anyone who looks at the Persian Gulf will see that Iran has access to everywhere in the Persian Gulf. All of the oil and gas installations and the bases, the Western bases, they're all very close to Iran's border. So that would be a worst case scenario. That would be catastrophic. And hopefully we will not see such a thing, because it would lead to an economic depression that is, I think, would be far worse than what we saw in 1929.
Yes, Professor Marandi, and Iran is indeed promising that such an outcome would occur, because not only does it have the capabilities to help precipitate this should it need to do so in self-defense, but also it's just an inherent quality of what would happen if Israel were to strike in this way. But I'm wondering, Professor Marandi, if you could...
This last scenario that I explained was linked to an American involvement. If it's between Israel and Iran, as I said, the Iranian response will be far stronger than any Israeli strike. But if the Americans respond or get involved, then I think we will have a war that will have consequences like no other.
Yes, indeed. I'm curious about what you've made of reports, if you've seen them. The Western mainstream media is very confused right now about how to assess Iran's capabilities, in particular after Iran's October missile salvo. On the one hand, you have the Washington Post admitting that targets were hit, military targets were hit by Iran, but what they claim is that Iran has exhausted its capabilities in the sense that it has essentially revealed all that it can do. The Guardian, on the other hand, has said not only has Iran not revealed all that it can do, but the fact that it was able to hit Israel without showing its full capabilities demonstrate that Iran could have the ability to do what it did on October 1st for many months at a time, should the U.S. and Israel escalate. Professor Marandi, do you have any comments or reactions to this seeming confusion by the West?
Absolutely. The Washington Post is talking nonsense. And I think they try to convince themselves about the situation being in their favor. And we saw that in Ukraine as well. So the Israelis right now, they were supposed to enter Lebanon. They hit a brick wall, and they've had high casualties. And Hezbollah has had almost, I think, 4 casualties from what I've been told by people inside Lebanon. 4 casualties in the battles. That's far less than what the Israelis have had. So, but the Americans thought this would be very easy, or at least that's what Western analysts and the Western media was saying. Their optimism is based upon wishful thinking when it comes to Hezbollah. They said that they're going to just knock out Ansar Allah in Yemen. Well, they still can't use the Red Sea. They thought the same about Gaza, that it would be over soon. all they did was massacre women and children, but they were never able to defeat the resistance, whether Hamas or Islamic Jihad, even though Gaza is a dot on the map. So I think they overestimate their capabilities, especially at a time when they're putting so many resources into Ukraine and spending hundreds of billions of dollars in Ukraine as well. So Iran can easily devastate Israel. There's no doubt about that. But Iran could do far more than that. Iran could destroy everything in the Persian Gulf region. So if the Americans want to take that risk or that option, then that's where we will go. Because Iran, there's no other option for Iran. If Iran does not establish deterrence, attacks will be repeated. If the Americans get involved, Iran has to hammer the Americans and those people that host America. Otherwise, the Americans will attack Iran again and again and again. So we've reached a point, and I think yesterday's Friday prayers was a very, very powerful message. There was lots of online chatter about Israelis attacking Iran and the Friday prayers. I'm sure you saw it. And people in Iran were being told that, to stay away. They were in the millions. I had never seen such a thing like that before. So everyone came and they were prepared to be attacked. And the leader spent a lot of extra time there, more than usual. There was a ceremony before the prayers for the martyr Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah, and then they began the prayers. He sat in that session too, in the same place, and then the Friday prayers. That was a strong message. So if the Israeli regime attacks Iran, that is what they're confronting a people who are prepared for war. Iranians just, there's outrage in Iran at what the Israelis have been doing in Gaza. And Iran is like no other country that I know of. It is willing to defend the Gazans. It is willing to defend the Lebanese. It is willing to make the necessary sacrifices to put the Israeli regime in a box.
Yeah, and I think October 1st demonstrated that not only is it willing to do this, but it has the capabilities to do so far greater than perhaps any other force in the resistance, albeit we have to give Yemen a lot of credit for taking the means that it did. But in terms of just outright military prowess, it goes to show that there is this capability that a lot of people, I believe, Professor Marandi, were doubting. And we still have some doubts from folks at, for example, naval institutes in the United States, which is who the Washington Post was interviewing. But at the same time, Professor Marandi, there is this, I think, actual fear coming from the U.S., those who actually make political decisions and military decisions in the United States. They are, it seems, very frightened by what could happen if Iran is forced to defend itself to an even greater degree. And now we've talked about the confusion on the part of the collective West, the Western mainstream media, on Iran's capabilities. What is the confusion about Israel's capabilities? Because I've been seeing a lot of talk about almost these F-35s being invincible, and that Israel could very well very easily conduct aerial strikes against Iran when it decides to do so. How accurate is this? And even if they do achieve some modicum of a response, what do you believe is the final end game here, given the fact that, as you said, Israel is the one looking far and far more weaker than it had prior to this past year, where we've seen, we're about a year into this genocide, we've seen Israel kill a lot of people, but at the same time not meet many of its stated goals. And I want to emphasize stated, because they may not actually be the goals, but they are stated and we should take them seriously still. But Professor Marandi, your take.
Well, before I respond, I should point out that there's also one other country which I did allude to briefly, and that is Iraq. Iraq today is not the Iraq of 5 years ago. And the resistance in Iraq if push comes to shove, it will have a huge role in defeating the United States. And the US and Western interests, as they call them, in Iraq will be swept away. And there's nothing that they can do. There's nothing they can do. The West is very vulnerable in this region. They will lose everything very quickly, especially with the situation in Ukraine, the horrible economic situation in Europe, and the problems and divisions that the United States has, and the internal problems, the economic problems. They're not in a position to take this region. But I think we have to go back to the first Iranian response. The first, as you recall, when the Iranians carried out that strike, which I explained earlier, what the intentions were, what did the West do? They ridiculed Iran. Instead of taking this seriously and seeing this as an opportunity to end the escalation, Western media, Western pundits all said this was a big win for the Israeli regime. And they tried to humiliate Iran, and they created an environment for further escalation, and which we saw with the murder of the martyr Haniyeh. So now if the West wants to continue to pretend that Iran does not have those capabilities, then I think they are leading their own families down the road to misery. Because if the global economy crashes, then their livelihood will be dramatically changed as well. Everyone's lives will be changed. Iran has sort of established a balance of terror with the United States. Just like during the Cold War, the Soviet Union and the United States had established a balance of terror, the Iranians and the United States have now, the Iranians have established a sort of balance of terror with the United States, because the Iranians can strike back at the Americans in a way which will bring down the American economy. No one wants that. As I said, no one in Iran, no one in the region, no one in the resistance wants escalation. But the West is hell-bent on escalation. They support the Israelis every step of the way. When they bombed the embassy, they supported it, and so on. So the West wants escalation. On the one hand, they're fearful, but on the other hand, they're pushing for more escalation. So it is a very, very dangerous situation right now. But Iran is determined to make sure that deterrence is established. And Iran's missile capabilities are enormous. Its drone capabilities are enormous. And I think if people in the West fail to appreciate that, then they are helping to create a situation where it would end very badly for everyone. Again, it goes back to, I remember many years ago, I was on Al Jazeera. The Iranians had, because of their standoff with the West, they decided to enrich uranium at 20%. Right? This was many years ago. This was before the 60% and all that we saw in recent years. I was on Al Jazeera, an expert, a nuclear expert, and I am no expert on nuclear issues. An American nuclear expert came on and said it is impossible for you, because Iran had just announced that they're going to enrich uranium at 20%, like hours earlier. So Al Jazeera invited me, Al Jazeera English. This was probably a decade ago, many years ago, maybe even more than a decade, and probably more. And he said this is impossible. The Iranians don't have the capability. It would take many months, if not years, for them to do this. And I said the Iranians will do it imminently, because when the Iranians say they're going to do something, they do it. Literally hours later, or after the show, I don't recall exactly, but like 2-3 hours later, the Iranians had enriched uranium at 20%. So this constant underestimation in the West, which I think is largely linked to Orientalism and a sense of superiority. And remember how Iranian missiles were all they were no good, and the Iranians were exaggerating their capabilities and all that. That's how the West likes to believe the situation is, which is fine for propaganda purposes. But if they believe their own propaganda, then it becomes very dangerous.
Thank you for tuning in to my latest video. I appreciate all of your support. This channel, however, needs your help. I am seeking to make this channel more sustainable in the long term and upgrade necessary equipment to ensure that this work continues onward and makes progress to give you all of the geopolitical analysis that you all deserve. For that reason, I'm asking you to become a member of my Patreon community at patreon.com/DannyHaiTong. You can find that link in the video description or in the pinned comment below. For whatever amount you choose to give, just know you are supporting independent media that you can't find anywhere else. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the next video.